South African apartheid was ended by internal factors such as the actions of the liberation movement of South Africa and the actions of Nelson Mandela. But what also ended apartheid was international pressure. Focusing in onto my home country of Australia for a second, we have to look back and recognise that Australia played a vital part in ending South African apartheid. Australia embargoed South Africa and applied international pressure. Hell, South Africa wasn't even allowed to participate in sports within our country. Australian trade unions, such as the Seamen's Union of Australia, were pioneers in boycotting South African ships and products entering Australia as early as the 1950s and 60s. Even though the government of the time opposed this action, many trade unions outright boycotted South African cargo. Politics-wise, starting with Gough Whitlam, Australia limited South African sportsmen from participating in Australia, and Malcolm Fraser signed the Gleneagles Agreement, formally banning South African sports teams from competing in or even entering Australia. Both parties agreed on this fact. Prime Ministers such as Bob Hawke and Malcolm Fraser were very pivotal in pushing the release of Nelson Mandela. And they were also active in international relations, pushing them to sanction the international pariah. Economic and trade sanctions in the 1980s also applied. We enacted reforms that limited trade with South Africa and limited their financial traction. And according to the government of Australia, we had very little bilateral relations with South Africa at this time. The sanctions in Australia lasted until the end of apartheid and were lifted in 1993. Australia heavily contributed to the international pressure in dismantling the oppressive system in South Africa, especially during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And by spearheading our international sports boycotts and limiting economic trade and oil trades with South Africa, we isolated them, and our direct financial support to the ANC played a role in the bigger picture of the ending of that system in South Africa. The Australian government under these prime ministers, isolated South Africa and forced reform. But you see, Israel's Israel's apartheid state is different. You see, Australia has been supporting Israel's crimes against humanity since their first breach of UN Resolution 242 in 1967. Um, Israel has established illegal settlements in the West Bank and has led a ethnic cleansing campaign of the Palestinian Arabs since that time in 1967. Israel has consistently breached UN resolutions and agreements, and reports have stated that Palestinians of the West Bank have had their homes demolished, wells poisoned, and their water cut off. And then they were forcefully relocated to walled settlements. This is a telltale sign of apartheid under military occupation as well. It's safe to say that both states are apartheid states, Israel and South Africa. Supporters of Israel will argue that within Israel itself, Arab citizens, approximately 20% of the population, have equal rights, vote, and hold high-level positions, distinguishing themselves from the South African apartheid system. However, it ignores the fact that millions of Palestinians living in the Israeli-occupied 1967 West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, who are not citizens, cannot vote in national elections and can never apply for citizenship within Israel. A lot of people forget as well that the Palestinians living in these zones will never have the opportunity to integrate within Israeli society, gain Israeli citizenship, immigrate, or leave their designated living areas. Within Israel itself, many Arabs actually report of disenfranchisement and attempts by local Israeli officials to deprive them of their right to vote. Another pushback to that argument is that reports of discriminatory culture-based land zoning laws and unequal access to resources that are being taken by Israeli settlers. Israel, Israelis deprive these people of clean drinking water and commit crimes against humanity, and we are forced to watch it in high definition on our TVs. Um, at least in South Africa, there wasn't a active military apparatus that defied international law in full view of the media being funded by the world's sole superpower, propping it up. Yeah, and this argument that Palestinians living within Israel have distinguished themselves in high positions. Think of the Passe Blanc people of the American South during the height of slavery. These were minorities that were loyal to the very system that oppressed their own people. If a segment of a minority group's population are willing to pseudo-speciate themselves and integrate themselves within the society that oppresses them, they of course can gain in that society. By hating their own people and acting as separatists from that minority group, just because segments of the minority group within the nation are able to climb just because these population groups are able to survive within the society that oppresses them, does that mean that they're not oppressed? Palestinian Arabs are not the only people who have suffered under a colonial rule or by a authoritative rule that have been able to integrate themselves within the conquered territory of where they've established that new nation state. Um, Palestinian Arabs are not allowed to enter Israel or apply for citizenships. They are second-class citizens within not only Israel but the whole Middle East, and every time a neighboring Arab country such as Jordan, Egypt, or Lebanon accepts Palestinian Arabs, the Israeli army uses it as a justification to continue to break international laws, run military escapades, strike their neighbors with uh, advanced equipment, steal resources, and lastly expand their borders. Which begs the question, why does Australia not boycott and stand up to the Israeli apartheid state and the genocide that they're committing? The close and friendly relationship that Australia has with Israel goes back to truly the foundation of the country. Following its recognition of the Israeli state on January 28, 1949, by the Chiefly government, Australia played a key role in Israel's admission to the United Nations later that very year. So Australia was one of the first nations to actually recognise Israel in 1948. And Australia views bilateral ties with Israel as deep and very productive. Even as they ethnically cleanse Palestinians of Gaza and rage a cleansing campaign of children in that area, we continue to expand our trade with Israel, amounting to 1.3 billion in the financial year of 2019 to 2020. This trade is also protected by an open relations agreement. This is far more than what we were trading with South Africa during the height of apartheid, and it's sickening. The Australian government, both Labor and Liberal, have generally opposed the boycott and sanctions movement, which leaders such as Anthony Albanese, the current Prime Minister of Australia, has described as racially targeted and counterproductive to a two-state solution. First off, Mr. Albanese, I'm not sure which race you are referring to, since Israelis are not a race. And second of all, the two-state solution is consistently downplayed by Israel. They do not want it. They have continued to expand their settlements in the occupied territories, and statements from Israeli political leaders undermine the future of the Palestinian state. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, adopted after the 1967 war, called for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied. In the conflict, and for all the states in the region to live in peace within secure boundaries. How can you honestly say that Israel has respected this agreement? They made it, uh, but yet they continuously break it. They continuously aid illegal settlement in West Bank and Gaza. They have consistently downplayed a two-state solution and have failed to respect the agreements that they've made. But the Zionists also flood the infosphere with anti-Arab sentiments and make us fear Arabs, especially capitalizing on the post 9/11 fear. Right-wing people are particularly prone to having anti-Arab sentiments. It gives Israel a easy out to pseudo-speciate the Arabs of Palestine and make the West fear Arabs, thus ignoring their genocide. Please remember, Israel is not above staging events and using social media to manipulate what their true goals are. Australia and Israel have had a long history of cooperation. Uh, Israel and Australia have cooperated in national security, defence, and cybersecurity since the start of the First Iraq War. Australia has been a firm military supporter of Israel for a very long time. So why do we not embargo them? Why were we more strict with South Africa and more lenient towards Israel? Why does Australia support the Israeli state? Well, here's my answer. The Zionist movement has led a financial campaign in Australia where IJAC, under the leadership of self-proclaimed Zionist Dr. Colin Rubinstein, has consistently financially contributed to both Labor and Liberal parties in Australia, establishing bipartisan pro-Israel ties in both major parties. IJAC and pro-Zionist organisations in Australia not only contribute heavily to both parties, but they also personally bribe our politicians by giving them expensive gifts, all expense-paid curated trips to Israel for our most influential politicians and businessmen and public servants. Over 500 Australian politicians, journalists, and public servants have taken trips to Israel in 2022 and 2023 alone. Uh, Israel has a culture of bribing and gift giving politicians that stems back to ancient Israeli and modern Eastern European culture. This was recently exemplified by the court trial of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where he was facing accusations of bribery, fraud, breach of trust, and receiving of gifts while in political office. And reports have stated that he has accepted direct gifts in the past. Corruption in the past has included not only Benjamin Netanyahu, but Olmert, Katsav, Deri, all these major Israeli politicians. And only in May of 2026 have Israeli courts lifted a publication ban on the investigation into bribery. It just highlights how little power Israel media and Israeli courts have over the rising corruption problem in their country. So when you wonder why we don't care about the Israeli apartheid in comparison to the South African apartheid, it's because the South African government were not personally bribing politicians as openly as Israel. And unfortunately, the truth is, the reason why we support Israel's genocide is because our politicians and the most influential people in our country, in Australia and the West, are easily bought off and corrupted. The reason why we support Palestinians getting offed in the streets by the IDF is because good old-fashioned money in the fucking pocket corruption. Elitist cruelty and pseudo-speciation of the working class and plebs is a psychological inevitability when large amounts of resources on the table for them personally to take. Unfortunately, the reason why Australia supports Israel comes down to three words: corruption and greed.